In the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, the lawns were always perfect, trimmed grass, white fences, and houses that looked nearly identical. The kind of neighborhood where everyone smiled politely but kept their real thoughts to themselves. George Whitman liked it that way. A retired contractor in his late 60s, he had lived on Maple Drive for over 30 years. He liked order, rules, and the comfort of familiarity. And to him, that meant people who looked, talked, and acted the same. So when a new family moved into the house next door, a young black couple with 2 kids, George's peace, in his mind, was disturbed. He watched them unload boxes from their truck, the father, Marcus Johnson, tall and broad-shouldered, his wife, Danielle, carrying a plan and smiling warmly at neighbors who pretended to wave back. Their children laughed, running through the yard. George frowned. "There goes the neighborhood," he muttered under his breath. That evening, as Marcus set up a basketball hoop in the driveway for his son, George stood on his porch, arms crossed. The bouncing ball echoed. Thump! 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 Too loud, he thought. Too different. He went inside, pacing. His wife, Helen, looked up from her knitting. "George, what's wrong?" "It's them," he said sharply. "The new family. Playing basketball in the driveway like it's some city park." Helen sighed. "They're just settling in. Give them a chance." But George's mind was already made up. 2 days later, he called the homeowners association to report a disturbance. When they dismissed it, he grumbled and decided to take matters into his own hands. That Saturday evening, as the Johnsons hosted a small barbecue with friends, George sat on his porch fuming. Music. Laughter. The smell of grilled ribs. It wasn't loud, not by any reasonable standard, but to George, it felt like chaos. When Marcus's friend parked briefly in front of his house, George snapped. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," he said. "There's a large group outside, loud music, strange cars. Looks suspicious." The dispatcher's voice was calm. "Sir, can you describe what's happening?" George hesitated, his words thick with bias. "It's a bunch of them out here. I don't know what they're up to." Within minutes, the flashing lights of a patrol car painted the street red and blue. The officers approached the Johnsons' home, hands near their holsters. Marcus stepped forward calmly, wiping his hands on a towel. "Evening, officers," he said evenly. "Can I help you?" "We got a call about a disturbance," one replied, scanning the yard. Danielle stepped beside her husband. "We're just having a barbecue. You're welcome to a plate." The officer glanced around, kids playing, adults chatting, soft music playing from a small speaker. Nothing out of order. "Sorry for the inconvenience, folks," he said finally. "Have a good night." As the police left, all eyes turned toward George's house. His blinds twitched closed. Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he muttered. Later that night, Danielle found her husband staring out the window toward the dark house next door. "Don't let him get to you," she said softly. Marcus nodded but didn't answer. "People like that," he said quietly, "they don't see us as neighbors. Just threats." She put a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll change that. Not by arguing, by living right next door. Every day." But a few weeks later, a heavy storm rolled in, lightning, rain, and wind strong enough to shake the trees. Power flickered across the block. And at the height of it, around midnight, a loud crack echoed through the neighborhood. George bolted upright. He ran to the window, and froze. A lightning strike had hit a tree in his front yard, splitting it in half. The flaming branches had crashed onto his roof, and smoke was already rising into the night sky. Helen screamed. "George! The house!" He stumbled toward the door, rain pounding outside, but before he could even grab the hose, he saw figures racing across the lawn, Marcus and his teenage son, carrying buckets of water. As thunder rolled, the same man George had called the cops on was now beating back flames to save his home. And in that moment, soaked and coughing in the rain, George's world, and his assumptions, began to burn away with the smoke. The storm was relentless, rain poured in sheets, lightning split the sky, and wind howled through Maple Drive like a scream. But over the roar of thunder, one sound stood out, the crack of fire eating wood. George Whitman stood frozen on his porch, staring up in horror as flames crawled across his roof. Smoke billowed into the storm, and embers rained down like fireflies. "George!" Helen cried from inside. "The kitchen's filling with smoke." He coughed, stumbling back inside, trying to think. "Call 911. "I already did. They said the roads are flooding, it'll take them time to get here." George's mind went blank. He'd lived through plenty of storms, but never this. The fire was spreading fast, licking toward the gas line near the garage. Panic clawed at his chest. Then, over the sound of rain, he heard someone shouting, "Mr. Whitman." He turned, and through the downpour, he saw Marcus Johnson, his neighbor, sprinting across the lawn with his teenage son, Ty, right behind him. Both carried buckets of water, their clothes soaked. "Get out of there!" Marcus yelled. "The roof's going to give." George could only stare, stunned. "What are you doing?" "Helping," Marcus shouted. Before George could protest, Marcus was up the steps, grabbing a heavy garden hose from the porch. Ty connected to the Johnson's spigot. Ty ran back through the rain, water splashing under his sneakers. Within seconds, the hose hissed to life, and Marcus aimed it at the flames spreading across the roof. Inside, Helen was coughing, her eyes watering from the smoke. "George, we need to leave." He turned toward her, but the doorway behind them collapsed in sparks and smoke. The kitchen was cut off. Marcus saw it from the porch. "Helen!" he shouted. "Come to the window." He ran to the side of the house, found the dining room window, and smashed it open with a fallen tree branch. "Come on!" he yelled. Helen hesitated, terrified. "I can't." "Give me your hand." Marcus reached through the broken frame, glass cutting his sleeve. Helen grabbed his hand, trembling. With one powerful pull, Marcus hoisted her out, helping her onto the muddy lawn. George stumbled out behind her, coughing, soaked, and shaking. They stood in the rain, watching helplessly as Marcus and Ty fought the fire, until the distant sound of sirens finally pierced the storm. By the time the fire department arrived, the blaze was nearly out. The roof was charred, the porch ruined, but the structure still stood, thanks to the very man George had once called the cops on. Marcus stood a few feet away, drenched and exhausted, his face streaked with ash. Ty leaned against him, breathing hard but grinning. "Guess we passed firefighter training, huh, Dad?" Marcus chuckled weakly. "Yeah, kid. You did good." George stared at them, speechless. His hands trembled, from shock, from cold, maybe from shame. Helen walked up first. Her voice was soft. "You saved our home. You saved us." Marcus wiped rain from his face. "You were our neighbors, Mrs. Whitman. That's what we do." George opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he looked at Marcus, really looked at him. Not as a stranger, not as a problem, but as a man standing in the storm, risking everything for someone who had treated him like nothing. The next morning, the fire trucks were gone. The storm had passed. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. George sat on his porch, staring at the blackened edges of his roof. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus's face in the firelight. When the sun finally rose, he saw the Johnsons' front door open. Marcus stepped out with 2 cups of coffee, still wearing a bandage where the glass had cut his arm. George stood, hesitated, then walked over. "Morning," Marcus said quietly, handing him one of the coffees. George blinked. "You brought me coffee?" Marcus shrugged. "Figured you could use it. Rough night." George stared at the cup for a moment, then took it with shaking hands. "I don't know what to say." "You already said enough last night," Marcus said, smiling faintly. "When you yelled at me to get out." George flushed, looking down. "I'm sorry." "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I came back." Helen joined them on the porch, her arm around Marcus's wife, Danielle, who had brought breakfast for everyone. Their kids were laughing in the yard, playing with Ty's basketball, the same ball that once drove George crazy. And for the first time, George didn't mind the sound. He looked around, at the laughter, the smell of pancakes, the shared exhaustion, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. He turned to Marcus. "You saved my life. My wife's. My home. And I treated you like an enemy." Marcus shook his head. "You treated me like a stranger. But I never stopped being your neighbor. George swallowed hard. His eyes were wet, his voice unsteady. Not anymore. Not ever again. From that morning on, the two families were inseparable, neighbors in every sense of the word. And whenever someone asked George about the fire, he'd smile and say, "It burned the roof, yeah. But it also burned down the wall between us." In the days after the fire, Maple Drive didn't look the same. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, blackened shingles still scattered across George's lawn, and the talk among neighbors spread faster than the flames ever had. Everyone knew what had happened. They'd seen the flashing lights, the fire trucks, the aftermath. But what no one expected was the headline that traveled through the neighborhood grapevine. The Johnsons saved George Whitman's house. By Monday morning, the same people who had once whispered about the new black family next door now couldn't stop talking about their bravery. But George heard the undertone in every conversation, the guilt, the awkward praise that didn't erase years of silence or side glances. And that, more than anything, made him restless. For the first time in years, George started to notice things he'd ignored before. When Marcus's kids waited for the school bus, other parents subtly pulled their children closer. When Danielle jogged through the neighborhood, people waved stiffly but never smiled. At HOA meetings, complaints about noise or too many visitors were always directed at the Johnsons' address, phrased politely but dripping with bias. He realized he'd once said the same things. Now, every word made him flinch. One Saturday morning, George was standing by his mailbox when Mr. Davis, the HOA president, walked up. "Morning, George. How's the house holding up?" "Roof's a mess, but we'll manage," George said. Davis nodded. "Shame about that storm. Though, I gotta say, pretty incredible what your neighbors did. Guess they're not as bad as folks thought." George froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" Davis chuckled awkwardly. "You know. Loud parties, too many cars, that kind of thing. You called the cops on them once, didn't you?" George's jaw tightened. "Yeah. And I was wrong." Davis blinked. "Well, sure, but..." "No but." George's voice rose slightly. "That man ran through fire for me. While the rest of us sat behind curtains and watched." The silence was heavy. Davis cleared his throat. "Right. Well, good neighbors are hard to find." George gave him a hard look. "You've got one next door. Try seeing him." That evening, the HOA gathered for its monthly meeting in the community hall. Usually, George sat in the back, quietly agreeing with every complaint. But tonight, he walked straight to the front. The first item on the agenda, noise complaints, 214 Maple Drive. The Johnsons' address. Davis began, "We've had several reports of loud gatherings." George stood abruptly. "That's enough." All eyes turned toward him. He took a breath, his voice steady but firm. "Those gatherings you're talking about are family barbecues. Kids playing basketball. Music that's no louder than the rest of ours. You want to talk about what's really bothering people? Fine. It's not the noise. It's the color of the people making it." Gasps rippled through the room. Davis stammered, "George, let's not turn this into..." "I'm turning it into what it is," George said sharply. "Because I've been on that side of the fence, pretending it's about rules when it's really about fear. And I won't sit here while good people are treated like intruders in their own neighborhood." Silence. Danielle, sitting quietly in the back, blinked in shock. Marcus put a hand on her shoulder. When no one responded, George nodded once. "Meeting's over." And he walked out. The next morning, Marcus found him in his yard, hammering shingles onto his roof. "Morning, neighbor," Marcus said with a faint smile. George looked down, shading his eyes. "You heard about last night?" Marcus chuckled. "The whole street did. You sure know how to make an exit." George climbed down the ladder. "I just said what needed saying. I owed you that." Marcus shook his head. "You don't owe me, George. You just had the guts to do what most people won't, admit they were wrong." George smiled faintly. "Guess you're rubbing off on me." Marcus grinned. "Could be worse influences." They laughed, and for the first time, it wasn't awkward, it was easy. Real. Weeks later, the Johnsons' barbecue returned, louder, happier, full of life. But this time, the guests weren't just family. George and Helen came too, bringing homemade pie. Even Davis showed up, awkwardly holding a bag of chips, trying to fit in. As kids played basketball and laughter filled the air, George leaned against the fence, watching Marcus flip burgers. "Funny," George said. "A while back, I called the cops because I thought your barbecue was a problem." Marcus handed him a plate. "And now?" George smiled. "Now it's the best thing on this street." They clinked their sodas together. For the first time in decades, Maple Drive felt like a neighborhood, not a row of houses, but a place where people saw each other. And George knew the fire hadn't just burned his roof that night. It had burned away the prejudice that blinded him for most of his life. The months following the fire brought peace to Maple Drive, the kind of peace that comes when fear turns into friendship. For the first time in decades, neighbors actually spoke to one another, smiled across lawns, shared food and stories. But more than anyone, George Whitman and Marcus Johnson had become close, two men from completely different worlds, bound by the night they survived together. George helped Marcus repair an old fence one weekend. Marcus helped George replace his roof the next. Their family started having Sunday dinners, the kids calling him Mr. George instead of Mr. Whitman. But life, as it always does, had another test waiting. It happened one hot July afternoon. Marcus had taken a construction job across town, while Danielle was home preparing for her small baking business launch. George was sitting on his porch, sipping iced tea, when he heard a loud crash, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your mind even catches up. He jumped up and looked across the street. A black SUV had swerved onto Marcus's driveway, smashing into the front of his garage. Smoke curled from under the hood. Then came the shouting. Two men in black hoodies jumped out of the car, arguing furiously. One of them pulled a gun. George's breath caught. Without thinking, he ran inside and grabbed the phone. "Helen. Call 911. He rushed back out, and froze again when he saw Danielle at the door, her daughter behind her, terrified. The man with the gun was yelling, waving the weapon wildly. "I told you not to follow me here." The other man shouted back, "The cops are coming, man, we gotta go." But the armed one wasn't leaving, he was panicking, pacing toward Danielle's porch. That's when George moved. He didn't think about fear. He didn't think about what he owed or what anyone might say. He just grabbed the nearest thing, his old metal rake, and ran straight into the yard, shouting, "Hey! Get away from them!" The gunman spun around, startled, the weapon jerking toward him. George dove behind Marcus's truck just as the man fired. The shot missed, echoing through the street. Neighbors screamed. Helen was shouting from the porch. Then Marcus's truck roared to life. George had turned the ignition. He slammed his foot on the gas, jerking the vehicle forward and forcing the gunman to jump back. The noise and chaos gave Danielle time to pull her daughter inside and lock the door. Sirens wailed in the distance. The gunman took one last look and sprinted toward the woods behind the houses, his accomplice close behind. Within minutes, police cars filled the street. When it was over, George stood trembling, leaning against the truck, breathing hard. Smoke from the SUV still filled the air. Marcus arrived minutes later, panic etched across his face. "Where are they? Is everyone okay?" Danielle ran to him, sobbing. "We're fine. Mr. George, he stopped them." Marcus turned to George, stunned. "You what?" George chuckled weakly. "Guess I learned something from you. Don't just stand there when someone's in trouble." Marcus's jaw tightened, emotion flickering across his face. "You could have been killed." George shrugged. "So could you, that night in the storm." They stood there in silence for a moment, both men understanding without words that they'd saved each other, twice now, in different ways. A week later, the story made local news again. Elderly man saves family from armed intruders. But this time, George insisted they include Marcus's family name in the headline. "It's not just about what I did," he told the reporter. "It's about what we built. Neighbors look out for each other, no matter who they are." That weekend, the Johnsons threw another barbecue, not just for fun, but to celebrate something deeper. George stood beside Marcus at the grill, flipping burgers. Helen and Danielle set up a table of homemade pies and cookies. The kids played basketball in the driveway, the ball echoing down the street. When one of the neighbors walked by, the same Mr. Davis from the HOA, George waved him over. Come on, Davis. Grab a plate. Davis hesitated, then smiled sheepishly. Smells good, George. It's not mine, George said proudly. It's Marcus's. Best food on Maple Drive. Marcus laughed. You only say that 'cause you burned your chicken last week. They all burst out laughing, and the sound carried down the street like a promise that things had truly changed. As the sun set, George looked around the yard, at the Johnsons, the laughter, the food, the peace that had finally taken root where anger once lived. He thought back to the first day he'd seen them move in, the bitterness in his own voice when he muttered, "There goes the neighborhood." Now, as Marcus handed him a plate piled with food, George smiled and said quietly, "There goes the neighborhood. Getting better every day."